If you're in your late 50s or early 60s here in the UK, there's a good chance your whole pension pot sits around £40,000. That's the median for people your age. Most of the advice you've been handed assumes you've got 10 times that saved up. So here's the number that actually matters. Cut the £15 watch instead of the branded one, ditch the car, skip the coffees, and you might save close to £200 a month. Do that for 5 years and it buys you exactly 2.1 extra years of retirement before the money runs out. 5 years of going without for just over 2 extra years. Why Gen X can't afford to retire is the wrong question to ask. What actually matters is how you close a £10,000 a year gap when the rules changed after you'd already made your plans. I've watched this play out with people who did everything reasonably right. You're 55, still earning a decent wage, and somehow also looking after an 80-year-old parent while your 24-year-old is back in the spare room because rents in Bristol have gone mad. That's not a failure. That's just where this generation landed. It's a strange kind of squeeze. Your parents' generation had a final salary pension waiting for them and a mortgage that felt achievable on one income. Your kids are watching rents in every big city climb past what a graduate salary can cover. You're standing in the middle of both of those stories, trying to hold your own retirement together while helping fund theirs. We're not going to spend this video telling you to save more or want less. I'm going to walk you through something called the income gap test and show you why being endlessly adaptable is actually a trap if you don't change your tax strategy before the 6th of April, 2027. That test takes about 2 minutes to run on your own numbers, and it tells you something the standard advice never does. Let's start with the number nobody explains properly. The full new state pension for the 2026 to 2027 tax year comes to £12,547 a year. That sits just £23 below the personal allowance of £12,570, which has been frozen for years. It means almost every pound of income from a private pension or a bit of part-time work on top of your state pension gets taxed at 20% from the very first pound. This isn't a temporary quirk either. The personal allowance has been frozen since 2021, while wages and pensions have kept rising with inflation. Every year that freeze continues, more of your income gets pulled across that £12,570 line, even though the line itself hasn't moved an inch. Say you draw £5,000 from a private pension on top of that. On paper that sounds modest. In practice, £1,000 of it disappears straight to HMRC before you've worked out what's left for the energy direct debit that month. That's the squeeze nobody mentions when they hand you the standard retirement checklist. Have you actually checked how much of your next pension payment survives contact with the taxman? Most people haven't, because nobody tells them to look. That's not the only mechanism working against a small pot. The old model tells you to live off 4% of your savings each year. With a pot of £40,000, that's £1,600 a year. That doesn't cover a single energy bill, and add a car insurance renewal that's jumped by a third, a mortgage payment that's just reset onto a higher rate, or a GP prescription charge, and it's gone before spring is even out. None of that is about being careless with money. It's about a formula built for a much bigger pot than most people your age are actually sitting on. Squeeze a small pot, thin enough to follow the 4% rule, and you protect the capital while starving the income you actually need to live on now. You aren't failing at retirement. You're playing a game where the goalposts moved while you were still at work. That's not a comfortable thing to hear, but it's true, and it changes what you should actually be doing about it. The Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association puts the moderate retirement standard for a single person at £32,700 a year. That's not a luxury figure. It's meant to cover the ordinary stuff, groceries, the odd meal out, a modest holiday. For someone sitting on £40,000 total, that number can feel like it belongs to a different currency altogether. Which and Hargreaves Lansdown both track the same shortfall every year, and the gap between what people have saved and what a moderate retirement actually costs keeps widening, not closing. But here's what nobody tells you about the frugality advice everyone keeps repeating. What if cutting back is actually making your maths worse, not better? Here's the framework I want you to actually use. I call it the income gap test, and it only takes 3 steps. First, work out your survival number, the bare cost of keeping your life running, meaning your mortgage or rent, energy, council tax, food and insurance. Second, subtract your state pension, £12,547 a year for most people from the 2026 to 2027 tax year onward. Whatever's left is your gap. For a lot of people your age, that survival number lands somewhere between £22,000 and £28,000 a year once you add up the mortgage or rent, the energy direct debit, car insurance, and the weekly shop. It's not a guess. Pull out your bank statements from the last 3 months and add up what actually left the account. That's your real number, not the one from a magazine article. It usually surprises people in both directions. Some discover the gap is smaller than they feared. Others discover it's bigger, and that's better to know now than at 68. Say that gap comes to £10,000 a year, and you've got £40,000 sitting in a SIP. On its own, that pot covers exactly 4 years of the gap before it runs dry. Now compare that to cutting what people call the bloat, the streaming subscriptions, the coffees, the takeaways. Trim that hard, and you might save £1,200 a year. It would take 8.3 years of skipping every coffee just to fund 1 single year of that gap. So which one actually moves the needle? The pot you already have, or the coffee you're being told to give up? I used to tell people to cut the lattes. I was wrong. For someone in your position, trimming small spending is like trying to put out a house fire with a water pistol. It's not that it does nothing. It's that it can't possibly do enough. What actually moves the needle is closer to a fire engine, and for most people that means income, not restriction. A part-time consulting day, a small rental room, a few hours of tutoring a week, any of these move the needle in a way that trimming a streaming subscription simply can't. What I mean by that is what I'd call times sovereignty income, money that keeps coming in on your own terms, even in a modest amount, rather than money you've simply stopped spending. Do the maths on frugality long enough, and the ceiling becomes obvious. There's only so much you can cut from an already modest life. Income doesn't have that ceiling in the same way. There's also a deadline worth knowing about, and it isn't about frugality at all. Right now, you can put up to £20,000 a year into a cash ISA completely sheltered from tax. From the 6th of April, 2027, that limit drops to £12,000 a year for anyone under 65. Stocks and shares ISAs aren't touched by this change, only the cash side, which matters if you've been treating a savings account as your entire retirement strategy. This isn't a scare deadline plucked from nowhere, it's confirmed Treasury policy, and it matters most if you've been parking spare cash in a savings account, because it feels safer than a pension. The trade-off most people miss is this. Every year you leave cash outside an ISA, hoping for a slightly better rate elsewhere, you're gambling a guaranteed tax shelter against a maybe. Once the allowance shrinks, you don't get that room back. If you're tired of being told a £15 watch is the secret to financial freedom, hit subscribe. This channel builds retirement plans for the real UK, not the fantasy version. To understand why the maths feels so unfair, it helps to go back to when you started working. Gen X walked into the job market right as final salary pensions were being shut down across the country. You weren't warned this was happening. You were simply the first generation handed a defined contribution pension instead and told to work out the rest yourselves. That matters because a final salary scheme guaranteed an income for life, calculated by your employer, protected from market swings. A defined contribution pot does none of that. It's just a number that moves with the stock market, and it's entirely on you to make it last. You were the test group for an experiment nobody asked you to join. Nobody sat you down and explained the trade you were making. You just started getting a different kind of payslip deduction, and the risk that used to sit with your employer quietly moved onto your own shoulders. According to the Office for National Statistics, a man aged 65 in the UK today can expect to live another 18.7 years, retire at 60, and you are funding 24 years of retirement. Wait until 66 instead, and you cut that by roughly a third. That single decision, when you actually stop working, is the biggest lever you control. That matters because most retirement plans are still built around the old assumption of maybe 15 years in retirement. Plan for 24 instead, and you need a completely different approach to how long your money has to last. Longevity used to be something to celebrate quietly. Now it's a financial risk nobody built a system around, but it cuts both ways. The same extra years that make a £40,000 pot feel impossibly small are also years you can still earn in, if you're willing to let go of what a normal retirement used to look like. The gold watch and the golf course were built for a generation that worked for one employer for 40 years and got a guaranteed income at the end of it. That model quietly died sometime in the 1990s. What replaced it wasn't a plan. It was you, a pot of money, and a set of instructions nobody ever double-checked would actually work. Let's walk through how this actually plays out for someone real. Your mother is 82 and needs home care, which runs about £800 a month. At the same time, your son can't get near a deposit for a rental in Bristol, so he's back in his old room. Both of those things can happen in the same year, and often do. Neither one waits politely for the other to finish. They tend to land in the same 6 months, usually while you're also still working. The unprepared response looks like this. You start pulling extra money from your pension pot to cover the gap. But you're already over your personal allowance, so 20% of every pound you withdraw goes straight to HMRC before it even reaches your mother's carer. It's gone within 2 years at that rate. I've seen people do this without realizing what it was costing them. They weren't reckless. They were just responding to a phone call from a care home, and nobody explains at that moment that a straightforward pension withdrawal comes with a 20% toll attached. Here's the question worth asking before you're in that position, not during it. Where would that money actually come from, and how much of it would you lose before it even arrived? There's a better way through it, using something called the Lump Sum Allowance. You're entitled to take 25% of your pension pot completely free of tax, up to a lifetime cap of £268,275. On a £40,000 pot, that's £10,000 you can draw out without HMRC touching a penny of it. That matters because the lump sum allowance isn't something you apply for through a lengthy process. It's simply how the tax-free part of your pension already works. Most people just don't think to plan around it in advance. Treat that 25% deliberately as a ring-fenced emergency fund for exactly this kind of situation, rather than letting it bleed out through ordinary taxable withdrawals. You don't need to draw the whole 25% at once either. It can sit there untouched until the year you actually need it. Draw from that tax-free bucket first when a genuine family cost lands on you, and you keep your regular withdrawals below the threshold where the 20% tax kicks in. It's not a way to make the caring or the crowded house disappear. It's a way to stop a genuine family emergency from also becoming a tax emergency. Most people only discover the lump sum allowance exists after the crisis has already started. Knowing about it beforehand is the entire difference. There's a reason so many people avoid logging into their pension account. Psychologists call it the ostrich effect, and it's not laziness, it's protection. If checking the number makes you feel worse, avoiding it feels like the safer option, even though it isn't. It's the same reason people avoid stepping on the scales after a heavy few months. The number itself hasn't changed by looking away. It just feels safer not to know it yet. I've watched this happen to people who are otherwise completely on top of their finances. They'll check their current account daily and their pension once every few years because the shame of a small pot feels heavier than the risk of not knowing. It's not your fault you don't have £500,000 sitting there. You came through 2008, the lockdowns of 2020, and the sharpest inflation this country has seen in 40 years, all while still trying to raise a family and hold down a job. Getting to 55 with anything saved at all, given what this generation has lived through, is closer to success than most people give themselves credit for. So here's a different way to look at the number. Stop thinking of your pension as a pot you have to live off for the rest of your life. Think of it as a bridge, one that only has to carry you as far as state pension age. Once you reach 67, the state pension takes over the heavy lifting. Your pot only has to fund the gap between now and then, not your entire retirement. If your gap is £10,000 a year, and state pension age is still 4 years away, you're not managing a lifetime of income. You're managing 4 years of it. That's a project, not a life sentence. That's a much smaller job than the one most people think they're facing, and once it clicks, the whole shape of your plan changes. First step. Instead of a hard stop where you go from working full-time to not working at all, look for what I'd call a soft landing income. That's a part-time job or a small freelance gig that brings in around £10,000 a year. It doesn't have to be glamorous. Consulting a few days a month in your old field, tutoring, driving, whatever fits your life. The number matters more than the title. £10,000 a year works out to well under £200 a week. Most people your age can find that in a way that doesn't take over their life. That works because the personal allowance resets each tax year regardless of when you claim your state pension. Earn £10,000 from work alone before your state pension starts, and you're still under the £12,570 threshold. It's one of the few genuinely simple wins left in this system. Second step, if you've got spare cash sitting in savings, use the full £20,000 cash ISA allowance while it still applies to you. From the 6th of April 2027, that drops to £12,000 a year for anyone under 65. If you're not sure whether your savings are already in a cash ISA, check your provider's app or statement. It's a 5-minute look that could be worth thousands over the next decade. This isn't a scare tactic. It's a confirmed change from HM Treasury. And it matters most if you've been treating cash as your main safety net rather than your pension. Third step, go on to gov.uk and check your national insurance record. This takes about 10 minutes, and most people have never done it. One missing qualifying year costs you 1/35 of your full state pension, which works out to roughly £358 a year for the rest of your life. Put that in perspective. That's close to what a lot of households now pay for a single car insurance renewal. One phone call can recover an amount that size every year for as long as you live. Filling a single gap year usually costs a few £100s through voluntary national insurance contributions, and it pays for itself within about a year of receiving the higher pension. When did you last actually look at that record? For most people, the honest answer is never, and that gap sits there quietly reducing every payment for the next 20 or 30 years. There's one thing that can undo all 3 of these steps, though, and it isn't the tax system. It's what happens when caring for your mother and supporting your son quietly eats into money you'd earmarked for yourself without you ever deciding that's what should happen. Knowing all 3 steps is one thing. Actually protecting them from the next family emergency is another. So where does this leave you? Frugality still has its place. It's a tool, not a strategy. Cutting genuine waste is sensible. But trying to close a £10,000 a year gap by giving up coffee and streaming subscriptions was never going to work. And now you know why, in actual numbers rather than a feeling. That's worth sitting with for a second, because most of the guilt people carry about their retirement savings comes from comparing themselves to a plan that was never realistic for this generation in the first place. You're not behind because you didn't try hard enough. You're behind a system that was redesigned twice while you were busy living your actual life. The real shift is toward income you control on your own terms, even in a small amount, alongside using the tax shelters you're entitled to before they shrink. That combination does more in a year than 5 years of extreme frugality ever could. It's not complicated. It's just different from what you were told to expect at 25. You don't need a normal retirement because you've never actually had a normal economy to build one from. You came through the end of guaranteed pensions, the 2008 crash, a global lockdown, and the highest inflation in 40 years, and you're still standing here, still planning, still asking the right questions. That's not a generation behind. That's the most adaptable generation in living memory. If you're ready to build a retirement plan that actually fits the life you've got, not the one from a 1990s brochure, hit subscribe and stay with Arthur's UK Retirement Guide. There's a lot more of this to work through together, and it starts with your own numbers, not someone else's.